Well, I'm Claire Sheahan, the CEO and president of the Alliance for Health Policy, and I'm joined now with Liz Hamel, who was so gracious to join our webinar and share with us some of her polling. Liz comes to us from Kaiser Family Foundation and has years and years of experience looking at what voter priorities are in healthcare. And we're so grateful that she joined us not just for the webinar, but to take some one-on-one questions from members of the Alliance community who wanted to know more. So Liz, thinking about both the webinar and the conversations that you had in the one-on-ones, I'm wondering what kinds of questions have you gotten on your polling?
It's interesting. I always get and I always appreciate a lot of questions about polling methods because I think some people assume that polling is easy, but it's actually quite complicated. But I do get a lot of questions about, well, how can you possibly get a sample of the public? Because who picks up the phone these days to answer the surveys? And I never answer surveys, so how can your surveys be representative? I love to talk about the science of how we do surveys. And so I do get a lot of those types of questions. I think another question that I get a lot is people really kind of are struck by the fact that often the public may seem to hold conflicting views. So they might answer questions about health policy that indicate that all of their policy preferences line up, or a lot of their policy preferences line up with one candidate, and yet they'll tell you they're going to vote for another candidate. And so I really love talking to people about how, the public and voters are not always consistent with their answers. And it really sort of takes a lot of different questions with a lot of nuance to understand how voters think about healthcare and how they think about elections and voting decisions.
So people aren't robots, right? So, and I think you pointed out too in our webinar that there are things besides issues that people vote on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that I love to remind people, especially people who are very focused on the policies, that voters don't necessarily think like you do. They're not going and reading the details of candidates' proposals or the existing legislation. They have a lot going on. A lot of voters are really just, they're people who are struggling financially. They're trying to put food on the table. They're trying to get their kids off to school. And so a lot of the way voters think about elections is more about sort of their affinity for specific candidates, their emotional reactions to what they hear candidates saying, and not always specifically about the issues.
Makes sense. And when you, just to take a step back, you had mentioned that you get a lot of questions about methods and particularly around, it sounded like the representativeness of polling. Are there any, answers that you share in that you'd like to share with us?
I think something that I mentioned on the webinar and that I like to remind people is the importance of transparency when it comes to polling methods. Again, I don't expect the average consumer of polls to have the expertise to sort of read a polling methodology and understand the details, but I think the more information that a polling organization gives about its methods, the more that you can be confident that it's a transparent organization. And I think that is a really key thing to look for.
Great. When you think about those questions, is there one that you get frequently besides the ones we've already discussed that comes up sort of again and again when you present your findings?
I do, even though we don't do horse race polling at KFF, I find that most people, that's what they want to talk to me about. They really, people really want to know who's going to win and how they can use polls to figure out who's going to win. And so I do find myself constantly reminding people, any given poll is a snapshot in time. It's one piece of information that you can use to understand the dynamics. But anybody that takes a poll, especially one taken now, and uses that to confidently state who's gonna win in November. I think that is not a great use of polls and surveys.
Right. So, is there a question when you think through all the questions you did get, and you got some questions today from the one-on-one people as well? Is there ever a question you sort of wish people would ask or wish people would ask more?
I mean, I do wish that people would also focus more on what we can learn from surveys about people's experiences. Because to me, that's one of the things that we really try to do with our surveys that I think adds a lot of context, as opposed to just focusing on how do people think about this policy. Questions about how many people are struggling to afford their healthcare bills, how does that fit in with their other worries and concerns? What can we learn from surveys about that? I do think that that's something that I wish people would focus on, in addition to sort of the public opinion and the voting side of what we
Right. So
learn from
more
surveys.
than just attitudes, also experiences
Mhm.
and kind of impacts. Are there any shifts that you are tracking as we look at the polling as we move through the next months leading up to the election?
I would say we are really just looking towards what kind of events are going to happen between now and the election that could potentially lead to big shifts in voters' attitudes. There's a long way to go. Trump involved in a trial right now. We have some debates coming up. We'll be looking at how those events do or don't produce shifts in how voters are thinking about the election, at least at the presidential level.
Great. So some big healthcare news breaks, potentially that could also result in shifts as well. So, well, that's great. That's what I have for you in our one-on-one today. Thank you so much for joining the Alliance program. We really appreciate having you and getting the chance to dig into your research. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.